let's get right into it with David Swanson. So David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, radio host. He's the executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. That's how I know him. Swanson's books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org. He hosts a Talk Nation Radio. He's been a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. He was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. He's on the advisory boards of Nobel Peace Prize Watch, Veterans for Peace, Assange Defense, Military Families Speak Out, and he is an associate of the Transnational Foundation. David, did I get all of that right?
As far as I could tell, yeah. Thank you.
Man, sorry. Yeah, you got a long Wikipedia page. So I guess with that, David, talk to us a little bit about American wars right now. Yemen, Afghanistan, where are we? Where are we going?
You want me to talk for about 15 minutes? Is that the plan?
Yeah, talk to as much as you can for 15 minutes, and then we will do a Q&A with people. So please ask questions in the chat, and I will get that to David. And if at any point I feel like we need to interject with a question, I might do that. But for now, go ahead, David. The floor is yours.
That would be fine. And I'll try to be brief because I tend to be long on the questions and answers. And if I'm too long, you just let me know. See if I can make 10 points fairly quickly here. Point number one, victories that are only partial victories are still real victories. And I say this in particular about the quote unquote ending of the war on Yemen, announced by US President Joe Biden some days back. I think it's very clear that this does not mean that the US military, left to its own devices, is going to stop providing information to the Saudis on who to kill and where. It does not mean the immediate lifting of the blockade that is causing starvation in Yemen. It does mean that if we keep up the pressure from the US public, from activists around the world, from people putting their bodies in front of weapons shipments, from labor unions and governments cutting off weapons shipments, from media outlets, from the Congress forced to act, from cities passing resolutions, from institutions divesting from weapons, from institutions being shamed out of taking the funding from warmongering dictatorships. I don't know if you all saw Bernie Sanders yesterday denouncing Neera Tanden for all of her corporate funding, but never mentioning the funding from the dictatorship of the United Arab Emirates. And so you have the Republicans respond, oh yeah, no, we love corporate funding. Don't worry about that, Neera. What if Bernie had mentioned foreign dictatorship funding? Who knows how the Republicans would have responded. If we increase all these kinds of pressure, if we keep it up, we are certainly going to see some weapons shipments stopped or at least delayed. In fact, we already have. We are certainly going to see some types of US involvement in the war stop. And to the extent that we protest any ongoing participation in the war as a broken promise by Joe Biden, we may get more out of this than he intends us to get. On a webinar this afternoon, Congressman Ro Khanna said that he thinks this announcement from President Biden to end all, quote, offensive war making in Yemen means that the US military cannot participate in any way and will not participate in any way in bombing Yemen or sending missiles into Yemen or firing on Yemen in any way. It means you can only do defensive things, protecting civilians in Saudi Arabia when a missile comes into Saudi Arabia. Now, Congressman Khanna also said he's worried about certain people on the National Security Council and efforts to define defensive to mean offensive. And we can talk about who he's worried about and who he isn't. But the point is that this is progress. This is a major step forward, and we have to recognize both the achievement, how to build on it, how to duplicate it, and the shortcomings and the need for ongoing vigilance and activism. Point number two, and these get shorter as I go along. Point number two, the general obsession of everybody with the character of individual politicians is of absolutely no help to us whatsoever. So when I say that our progress in ending the war on Yemen is a victory, and somebody says to me, no, it isn't, because Biden doesn't really care about peace and isn't really a good person and is moving us toward war in Iran or Russia or, fill in the blank. I don't care. This is not a contradiction. The fact that Joe Biden is not a peace activist is precisely the point. Getting a peace activist to take steps toward peace is not a victory at all. It is not something to celebrate. We're celebrating when we force people in government who couldn't care less about peace to do something in the direction of peace. So our concern should not be risking having somebody call us a sucker. Our concern should be building power to advance the agenda of peace. Number three, I'll just give you the title. Political parties are not teams, but prisons. Political parties are just as bad to be devoting your loyalty to as individuals. Number four, occupation does not bring peace. So I think with Yemen ending and progress toward being done with that disaster, Afghanistan jumps to the top of the list. You have all these Congress members prepared to reintroduce a war powers resolution to again end the war on Yemen and not have it vetoed this time. They don't have to do that now. They're not going to do that now, even if we might like them to. They need to do it on Afghanistan. That's the next one on the list. That's the point of finally, after all these years, for the first time, using the war powers resolution of 1973 and ending a war through Congress, is once you've done it, now you do it again with another war and then another war. In Afghanistan, the US military and its sidekick obedient puppy nations have been bringing peace to Afghanistan for almost 2 decades without any peace in sight, not counting all the damage done prior to that date. And there have been ups and downs, but generally a worsening of the situation, usually worsening at times of troop increases, almost always worsening at times of bombing increases. Since before some of the military participants in the war on Afghanistan were born, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan has been saying that things would be bad and possibly worse when the United States military pulls out, but the longer it takes before doing that, the worse that hell is going to be. There's a book I've just been reading that's new by Séverine Autesser, if I'm saying her name correctly, called The Front Lines of Peace, that makes the point with numerous examples that successful peace building usually involves organizing local residents to lead their own efforts to counter recruitment and resolve conflicts, and the work of unarmed peacekeepers from outside of areas around the globe shows huge potential and success. If Afghanistan is ever going to have peace, it's going to have to start with getting the troops and the weapons out of Afghanistan. The top supplier of weapons and even a top supplier of funding to all sides, including the Taliban, has often been the United States government. Afghanistan does not manufacture weapons of war. They are brought in. Point number 5, demilitarization is not abandonment. This is the word you will find in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Don't abandon the poor Afghans. Don't stop kicking in their doors. It would be abandoning them. There are 32 million people in Afghanistan, most of whom have yet to hear about 9/11, much less are responsible for it, and a significant percentage of whom were not alive at that time, 2001. You could give each of them, including children, including wealthy drug lords, a $2,000 survival check for 6% or so of the $1 trillion every year dumped into the US military, or a tiny fraction of the many trillions squandered and wasted on this war, or the countless trillions in damage and destruction done by this endless war. I'm not saying that we should do that or that anyone ever will do that. Just getting them to cease what they're doing and get out is the dream at this point. But if you wanted to not abandon Afghanistan, There are ways to engage with a place other than bombing it and kicking in people's doors. But let's just end the pretense that the US military is after some sort of humanitarian good. Of the 50 most oppressive governments on earth, 96% of them are armed and or trained and or funded by the US military. Afghanistan is not, is not some sort of exception here. On that list of the most oppressive governments in the world are the partners in the war on Yemen, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt. And on that list is Bahrain, which is hitting 10 years now since the crackdown on the uprising there with US support. Point number 6, these victories against wars are global and local as well as national. We get a lot more done at the local level and internationally when people act together across borders than just nationally with this broken, heavily militarized US government. The European Parliament today, following the US action, opposed weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE. The German government had long since cut off weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and was moving on the other ones. Other governments around the world. Afghanistan is a huge opportunity. There are numerous nations playing little token roles through NATO that can be pressured to remove their troops and at long last get out of Afghanistan. And doing so will help get the United States out. This is also a local movement, cities and localities that have been passing resolutions and pressuring national officials. This is something that should continue. Number 7, it matters and it helps that Congress did this. If Biden had refused to take any significant step on ending the war on Yemen, Congress would have done so because Congress did so 2 years ago for the first time ever and would have been pressured to do so again by the US and global public. And now that Congress doesn't have to do it again, it can take the next war on the list. There's also this effort that we can talk about to form a caucus in the US Congress of members that want to decrease military spending and move funding to actual crises that need it for human and environmental needs. And I think it's important that we recognize what this is and what it might not be. We have, some of us lived through decades of having, long lists of Congress members commit to opposing military spending, to absolutely demanding moving money out of the military. And then the vast majority of them turn around and vote the other way. So we want to get people into this caucus, don't get me wrong, but we want it to mean something. And we don't want it to mean that they'll sign a press release. We want it to mean that they will vote against any military funding bill that does not move at least 10% out. It only takes one house of Congress to say no to something. And it only takes a small number of Democrats to say no to something when Republicans are likely to say no to it for their own cockamamie reasons. But Congress members, typically, your quote unquote progressive Congress member typically will say, I'm opposed to military spending and consider their job done. And then find something in a military spending bill, something related to women's rights or identity politics or LGBT participation or God knows what, something nice, and they'll vote for it. And so we have to get a real commitment and make sure we can believe it. Number 8, again, it matters that the War Powers Resolution was used finally, and we have to make this routine and get it used again and again. Number 9, it matters, it's terrific also that ending weapon sales is a central part of ending this war on Yemen, because it needs to be part of ending militarism around the world. The United States is the top weapons supplier to poor countries, democracies, dictatorships, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and this has to end, perhaps with Congressman Ilhan Omar's bill on this being a step in the right direction. And number 10, we should also remember the extent to which bases are a part of these wars and a goal of these wars and an instigating force in getting these wars going. And we need to not just end the bombing of Afghanistan, but get the US military bases and NATO bases out of Afghanistan and work on getting them out of many more places. As expensive and provocative and counterproductive and and racist, bigoted, apartheid, giant gated community operations around the world that we don't have the money for, and the world cannot survive the continuing influence of this global archipelago of military bases. So those are some initial thoughts. Love to hear what you all are thinking. And Ryan, I think, is going to give us something we can do in a little while as well.
That's right. That's right. We're going to do a quick Q&A now. So please ask your questions in the chat. We have several good ones right now. Off the top of my head, though, just with where you finished there, how many military bases do we have now not in America? Do you know?
Well, there is not necessarily a soul alive who could tell you, and it certainly depends on how you define bases, what counts as a U.S. base and what counts as a bunch of U.S. troops in somebody else's base and so forth. But there's at least 800, maybe over 1,000, depending how you slice it. And the big ones, the major ones with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of US troops, some of them labeled NATO bases, some because that's more acceptable in Italy, for example, to have a NATO base. Most of them labeled US bases. They're in about 80 countries around the world. And they are very often deeply resented and protested. And there's a great story just recently of blocking and preventing with human shields and camps the construction of a new NATO base in Montenegro. The people of the Czech Republic have prevented a new US weapons base there. There are successes, but for the most part, these bases are just built and expanded and just roll right over any public opinion in the so-called free world. And they continue to be built and expanded at a rapid pace, somewhat disturbingly across Africa, maybe more disturbingly around China, and even more disturbingly right up to the western border of Russia.
Yeah, not good. It would feel a lot like you're under attack if there was a base right on your border, I imagine.
If you get, sorry, one more point. If you get David Vine's most recent book, he's a professor at American University, David Vine, he really documents the evidence that the bases are a cause of war. They're not a tool used in war. They're not something to prevent war. But when you go looking for causes of war, it's not humanitarian, it's not human rights abuses. The U.S. is partnered in these wars with the worst human rights abusers. It's not, it's not the need to spread democracy. It's not, the presence of the wrong skin color or religion. It's certainly the presence of fossil fuels. That's a strong correlation, but it's also where the bases are, you're more likely to get the wars.
Can you please?
I imagine that creates some of the blowback that radicalizes people in the first place, just being next, right there the whole time, having it in your face like that.
95% of suicide attacks in the world, terrorist attacks in the world, are motivated by opposition to foreign occupation.
Can you give us the name of that David Vine book?
Yeah, Vine with a V.
Oh, Vine. Okay, good.
1 second, I'll get it and show it to you. I thought I would.
That's in the library.
Now that we know his name is David Vine, we can look it up.
Yeah, I got too many books, but it's something like the U.S. State of War. He has a number of books. I recommend all of them. He wrote a book about Diego Garcia. He wrote a book about bases called Base Nation. But his more recent one is also very much about bases, even though it's called something like the State of War, and it's about the endless U.S. wars. And there's never been a moment since the creation of the U.S. without it being at war and so forth. But it's very much about bases, and goes beyond the previous one, which was called Base Nation.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So a couple questions from people. We kind of talked about some of these root causes, but Dana's asking, violence is an endless cycle. It just keeps going. What is the root problem? And they talk a little bit about identity being a part of that. And I think we talked a little bit about that, you know, the blowback of effect of bases and the radicalization that takes place when you're dealing with that. Do you think that there's some like mental health implications to all of this that's causing more violence?
I mean, there's all kinds of violence in the world, but when you're talking about the major wars, and you're talking about the wars that use the major weapons manufactured and distributed from the big wealthy weapons dealing countries, you're talking about profit motivations, you're talking about political motivations, and you're talking about the madness and the power grabbing of people in power. I mean, when you watch these hearings that you've been talking about, Ryan, how Roots Action has been opposing some of these worst nominees for high office in the U.S. government and stopping a couple of them. You watch the hearings of the ones that have to do with foreign policy. There's almost not a single question about their past performance, their resume. The top subject in all of them is, how much do you hate China? Are you willing to hate China? Can you get more belligerent toward China? Will you threaten China? Will you join us in threatening China? Does China want to be number one? Is China trying to be the greatest country on earth? Do you think China's going to pass us? What can we do to stop them? You know, and it's sort of this blurring of the line between some sort of economic competition, prestige competition, and military enmity. And so because China hasn't wasted trillions of dollars on wars and is doing okay economically, and, you know, things are looking better for people in China and worse for people here, the answer, of course, is blow more money on more wars and more weapons. That'll fix it. That'll teach them, you know, and so it's not, you can't find sane, rational explanations for all of it. There is an element of madness. I think Dan Ellsberg is right to quote Friedrich Nietzsche that, you know, madness is not common among individuals, but it's the norm in societies. And this society is certainly no exception. There's just absolute military madness. But there's also a huge profit motive, and that the U.S. government is largely bought and paid for by the weapons dealers, the media outlets. You know, if a Congress member talks about peace, they'll never see their face on TV again. There's, you know, if you want to get a good job, you know, when you're out of Congress, you know who to kiss up to and how. If you want to move up in the State Department, you sell more weapons. You don't, you know. So there's structural problems and corruption problems, as well as cultural problems. I don't know if you saw today that the NBA basketball team that had dared to stop playing the national anthem at the start of games, which used to be a wartime thing, you know, under public pressure, reinstated the war song. You know, this is the culture we're in.
Yeah, and I think that kind of culture and those kind of pressures extend beyond just why, you know, run-of-the-mill Democrats and Republicans support war, and the corporate Democrats. Sharon asks, why doesn't the National Progressive Caucus champion cutting the military budget? Amanda, it's Pramila Jayapal and the Progressive Caucus. Why isn't this one of their core issues?
Well, it is, to my understanding. I don't know if there are some that are a little bit more core than this, but lately it's been in their list of demands. But what backs up those demands? What reality will we see of this alleged strengthening of the Progressive Caucus that we heard rumored about some months back? They were going to tighten up what it meant to be in the Progressive Caucus, even if that meant they would have fewer members. It was going to mean they were committed to certain things. Well, are they going to make a commitment to vote against bills that continue or expand military spending? Because if they aren't going to do that, how much do I really care that they put out press releases saying they don't like increased military spending? I can do that myself. You can do that, right? So, it used to be that often they wouldn't even mention it. So we can consider that progress, that they'll mention it. Sometimes they would put out this, people's budget with help from various, think tanks in Washington, D.C., and they wouldn't touch the military budget, or they would cut it by literally 1%. So they're now very much on board with moving at least 10%, if not significantly more, at least the co-chairs of that caucus and the alleged co-chairs of the alleged new caucus, the quote unquote defense spending reduction caucus. But if neither one of them makes a credible commitment that everybody who's signing their name is actually going to take a stand, then it's just public relations.
Right. And I think one thing to follow up with on that is that be on the lookout in the coming weeks or months. There are teams looking into the Progressive Caucus specifically and finding out who amongst them really is progressive and who is not. So be on the lookout for something about that. See if we have any more questions before we move into our action. We got one from Brody. I'm just going to read it because I haven't seen it yet. We do need to keep the U.S. safe from cybersecurity attacks from other nations, Russia, China, on our infrastructure. So money from military bases should be directed to protecting us from cybersecurity. Does that make sense to you, David?
Perhaps in part. I don't think redirecting military money to anything can ever really make sense, because it's such an unfathomable pile of money that you'd spend it all and have 99% of it left and try to figure out what to do with that. I also think that, people in the United States should stop being ignorant of the fact that Russia for years has been proposing to put together a global treaty banning cyber attacks, and the United States has been refusing and has been engaging in cyber attacks and has been bragging about its cyber attacks. And so for it then to say, well, we're threatened by the world and the world's cyber attacks is true. I'm not saying it isn't true, but the steps that could be taken and should have already been taken are not limited to dumping more money into a cyber arms race. There's also such a thing as supporting the rule of law. Biden hasn't even ended the sanctions against the top officers of the International Criminal Court. How do you get more lawless, how more rogue than that? So the first step isn't always fending off the irrational foreigners. Sometimes the first step is actually dropping the hypocrisy and supporting the rule of law. Right. But if you want to move money from bombs and missiles to computers, I'm not going to stop you.
Right. No, it's an improvement, but it's still so much money that it has to be better used elsewhere. We can't spend all of that money there. But good question. Just a couple more, running a little bit behind. I want to get to this action. Janet has a really great question. How can we get leaders in the climate movement to talk about militarism as contributing factor to the climate crisis? And I've actually seen this before where like climate regulations don't apply to the military a lot of the time. What do you know much about that, David?
Well, that's, may come from working at Roots Action. I think Roots Action has taken up, as well as World Beyond War, where I also work, has taken up this cause of trying to end the exclusion of military pollution from climate treaties. And I think this is one example of a cross issue, if you can really separate these issues, campaign, because, why wouldn't a group that wants to protect the climate want a major contributor to the destruction of the climate, namely militarism, to be included under Kyoto and Paris and so forth? They ought to, right? But just as anyone who cares about civil liberties ought to be opposing war, anybody who cares about transparent, open government, representative government, ought to be opposing war. Anyone who opposes racism and bigotry ought to be opposing war. Anyone who wants any funding for anything decent in the world ought to be opposing war. It's certainly anyone who cares about the natural environment opposing militarism ought to be near the top of their list. I mean, top polluter of water, of air, of land. There's no question. But again, there's this cultural problem, this resistance to that Star-Spangled Banner, that national anthem, banging away in the back of everybody's heads. There's resistance. So you find issues that cross over. You find the island that's going to be destroyed by the new Navy base. You find the treaties that ought to include militarism, and you start with the local and the state and regional climate groups, environmental groups, because they get it, and they aren't corrupted. Right. And you go to the groups that are more open, like Extinction Rebellion, and you work with them. And then if you can get the what is it called, the Sunrise Coalition, you work your way up to the global, Sierra Club that currently won't touch peace with a 10-foot pole. You work with the local chapters of your local Sierra Club, they're going to be great. They're going to be on board immediately. So, it's an ongoing effort that we can keep plowing away at.
Right. And okay, we're going to move to the action now. We still have a couple more questions that we'll get to, but I want to introduce this action now so people can get on it. And then we'll do a couple more questions. David, can you stick around for 5 or 6 more minutes with us?
Sure, of course.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'm going to share my screen real quick for this action. Also want to let everyone know that next week we will be talking about canceling student debt. And we will be joined by one of the co-founders of the Debt Collective, Thomas Goki. So be on the lookout for an invite to that. Does everyone see my screen?